The wind screamed down the Grand Dorsal like a living thing, clawing at canvas tents and whipping sand into the eyes of men who had already forgotten what clean air tasted like. Late February 1943. Kasserine Pass, central Tunisia. The freshly arrived US-2 Corps, green, over-equipped, and dangerously confident, had been thrown into the path of Erwin Rommel's veteran Afrika Corps. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter dressed up as a learning experience. 18 miles behind the front, in a narrow wadi outside Tebessa, Major General Lloyd Fredendall presided over his private war. He had ordered engineers to carve a fortress into the living rock. The excavation took weeks and diverted trucks, bulldozers, and hundreds of labor hours that might have gone to building forward supply dumps or reinforcing the actual line. The result was a bunker the staff nicknamed Shangri-La. Concrete floors poured in place, electric lighting strung like Christmas garland, a private bedroom, a flush toilet, the only one for miles, steel I-beams overhead, and sandbags stacked so thick that even a direct 500-pound bomb would have had trouble reaching the man inside. Fredendall rarely left it. When he did, he traveled in an armored command car with a motorcycle escort, as though he were already a 4-star general touring liberated Paris. From this buried palace, he conducted the war by telephone, teletype, and runner. His orders arrived at the front in dense, single-spaced paragraphs, written in the florid, archaic style of a man who had read too many Victorian military histories. He demanded precise coordinates for every battery, every machine gun nest, every reserve position, then refused to allow his division commanders to adjust those positions when the ground proved impossible or the enemy did something unexpected. Requests for clarification were met with rebukes. Suggestions were treated as insubordination. Colonel James Halverson, commanding the 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Red Bull Division, had been in North Africa long enough to recognize the smell of bad staff work. He had walked the ridgeline east of Fide Pass that Fredendall now insisted must be held at all costs. There was no cover. The slope was exposed to German 88s and 105s on higher ground 5 miles away. The soil was too rocky to dig proper slit trenches. Any unit placed there would be pinned and pulverized before it could even sight the enemy. Halverson radioed back a carefully worded message requesting permission to withdraw 1 battalion to a reverse slope position 300 yards behind the crest. The reply came within 20 minutes. Negative. Execute original order. Positions will be held as designated. Report compliance by 600 hours. No further discussion. Halverson read the words aloud to his operations officer in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The major, a former schoolteacher from Des Moines, let out a short, bitter laugh. "They want us to die in parade formation," he said. They died in fragments. At dawn on February 14th, Rommel's panzers, elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, smashed through the Fade Gap like a fist through wet paper. The 168th was caught in the open. German artillery registered the ridgeline within minutes. High-explosive shells walked up and down the line in precise batteries, lifting men out of their holes and throwing them back down in pieces. Machine guns chattered from the flanks. Panzer IVs rolled forward, firing main guns at anything that moved. By noon, the regiment had ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Survivors crawled into the cactus and rock, bleeding, screaming for medics who were already dead. Halverson survived the first day by the narrowest of margins. He led a small group of stragglers back across open ground under fire, carrying 2 wounded men between them. At nightfall, he counted heads. Of the 3,200 men he had led onto that ridge 48 hours earlier, fewer than 900 answered. The rest lay scattered across the stony ground, some still clutching rifles they had never had time to fire, others burned black by phosphorus grenades, many simply gone, vaporized, or buried under collapsing trenches. He sat on an ammunition crate in the dark, dog tags clinking in his fist, trying to make the numbers add up. They never did. Back at Shangri-La, Fredendall continued to dictate orders as though the front were merely experiencing a temporary inconvenience. When reports of collapse reached him, he blamed the troops. Panic, he told his chief of staff. Lack of discipline, poor junior leadership. He relieved battalion commanders by radio without ever seeing their faces or the ground they had bled on. He demanded counterattacks across ground his own reconnaissance had already reported as suicidal. When those counterattacks failed, as they inevitably did, he relieved more officers. The entire two-corps front began to unravel. American troops streamed rearward in disorganized columns, abandoning guns, trucks, tanks. German armor reached the village of Kasserine itself. It was the worst defeat suffered by American ground forces on land since the Battle of Bull Run. Headlines in the United States would soon call it the Kasserine debacle. In Algiers, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had been receiving the disaster reports in hourly increments. His face, normally composed, had taken on the tight, gray look of a man watching his own reputation burn. By the first week of March, he had made up his mind. On the evening of March 5, 1943, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith, drafted a terse message. It was hand-carried by an aide who flew through the night in a battered C-47 and landed on a dusty strip near Tebessa just before dawn. The message was 6 words long. "You are relieved of command. Report to Algiers immediately." No explanation. No court of inquiry. No press statement. Fredendall received it in the fluorescent glow of Shangri-La. He read the paper once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his breast pocket. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost relieved. "Pack my personal effects," he told his aide. "I'm going home." He expected disgrace. A quiet retirement. Perhaps a desk job in Washington, far from the cameras. He believed the system would finally hold him accountable. He was wrong. Washington had other plans. Fredendall believed his career was over. Washington believed otherwise. The dust still hung in the air over Kasserine like a shroud when the new commander arrived. March 7, 1943. A small convoy of 3 jeeps and a scout car rolled into the shattered headquarters area at Jebel el-Kef. The lead vehicle stopped in a cloud of red grit. A figure in a polished helmet, pistol belt, and immaculate field jacket stepped out, slapped the dust from his trousers, and surveyed the wreckage of 2 corps without expression. George S. Patton had come to take command. He did not go to ground. He did not ask for a bunker. He set up his headquarters in a commandeered schoolhouse in Feriana, sleeping on a cot in a room with broken windows and maps pinned to the walls with bayonets. The first thing he did was order all division and regimental commanders to report to him personally, face to face, not by radio. He wanted to see their eyes. The second thing he did was drive to the front. He stood on the same ridgeline where the 168th Infantry had been torn apart 3 weeks earlier. Bodies had been cleared, but the evidence remained. Shell craters the size of small cars, burned-out tank hulks, scattered webbed gear, blood-soaked bandages stiff in the sun. Patton walked the ground slowly, hands behind his back, head down, as though reading a book written in craters and scorch marks. Colonel James Halverson was among the officers summoned that afternoon. He arrived expecting another relief, another scapegoat ritual. Instead, Patton greeted him with a firm handshake and a single question. "How many men did you lose here?" Halverson answered without hesitation. "More than 2,000, sir, in 48 hours. Patton nodded once. "And how many did the enemy lose?" "We counted about 200 German dead on the ridge, maybe 300 total." Patton's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Then we paid too much." He turned to the map table. "Show me exactly where Fredendall told you to put your battalions." Halverson traced the ridgeline with a finger. Patton studied the line, then looked up at the high ground the Germans had used for observation. "He put you in a shooting gallery," Patton said quietly, "and then blamed you for bleeding." Halverson said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Patton straightened. "From this moment, you have my permission, my direct order, to use your own judgment on the ground. If you need to shift a company, shift it. If you need to pull back a battalion to save it, pull it back. I will back you. If higher headquarters complains, they can talk to me. Understood?" Halverson felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in weeks. "Yes, sir." Patton turned to the rest of the assembled officers. His voice carried without raising. "I want every man in this corps to understand one thing. We are going to fight. We are going to attack. We are going to kill Germans. And we are going to do it until they are dead or we are dead. But no one dies because a staff officer in a bunker 20 miles away thinks he knows better than the man with mud on his boots. Is that clear?" A low chorus of "Yes, sir." Patton looked at them a moment longer. "Then get back to your units. We move in 48 hours." The transformation was brutal and immediate. Patton demanded aggressive reconnaissance, constant patrols, constant contact. He pushed artillery forward, so close that forward observers could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. He ordered tanks to maneuver in pairs, never alone, and to use terrain instead of charging across open fields like tin ducks. He relieved 2 regimental commanders in the first week. Not for failure, but for timidity. Word spread quickly. Patton did not tolerate hesitation. He did not tolerate excuses. But he also did not tolerate stupidity. The same men who had broken at Kasserine now moved with something close to purpose. The 1st Armored Division, once scattered and demoralized, began to counterattack with coordinated infantry tank teams. The 34th Infantry Division, still carrying the scars of Faid, dug in on reverse slopes, used defilade, and held. When German probes came, American artillery answered before the panzers could close. By late March, the same 2 corps that had streamed rearward in panic was advancing: Gafsa, Maknasi, El Guettar. Small victories, but victories. The Germans began to pull back. Rommel himself would soon be recalled to Europe. The Africa Corps would never again advance so far north with such ease. Halvorson's regiment fought again on March 23rd at El Guettar. This time they held the high ground. This time they used the terrain instead of fighting against it. This time the artillery came when they called. They took casualties. War does not forgive, but the losses were measured in dozens, not thousands. The regiment stood when the counterattack came. They broke it. They buried their dead. They moved forward. At night, in the command post, Patton would walk the perimeter, stopping at foxholes, talking to soldiers by name. He asked about their families. He asked if they had enough ammunition. He asked if they were scared. He never told them not to be. He simply told them to keep fighting. Halvorson watched it all from the edge of the CP. He saw men who had been shell-shocked 3 weeks earlier, now standing straighter. He saw officers who had been relieved by Fredendall, now leading patrols with quiet confidence. He saw the same army, same rifles, same tanks, same exhausted faces, become something different. Nothing had changed, except the man giving the orders. The flight from Tunis to Washington took 16 hours, with a refueling stop in Casablanca that felt like an eternity in the rattling belly of a C-54 transport. Major General Lloyd Fredendall spent most of it staring out the small window at the endless blue of the Atlantic, his mind replaying the last moments in Shangri-La. The aide's knock on the steel door, the folded message, the calm that had settled over him like a drug. He had expected the worst, a court-martial, a public humiliation, the end of 30 years in uniform. Instead, silence. Polite nods from the pilots, a bottle of champagne waiting in his quarters at the airport hotel in D.C. When his plane touched down at Ballingfield on March 25, 1943, he was met by a full military band. The musicians were lined up on the tarmac in crisp olive drab, instruments gleaming under the spring sun. As Fredendall stepped down the gangway, they struck up "The Stars and Stripes Forever." The brassy notes echoed off the hangars, sharp and triumphant. A crowd had gathered, reporters from the Washington Post and New York Times, Army public relations officers, even a few congressmen in civilian suits with American Legion pins on their lapels. Flashbulbs popped like distant artillery. Hands clapped him on the back. Voices shouted questions over the music. "General, how was the fighting in Tunisia?" "General Fredendall, what can you tell us about the victory at Kasserine?" "Victory." The word hung in the air like smoke. Fredendall forced a smile, adjusted his garrison cap, and raised a hand in salute. The band played louder. Behind the scenes, the orchestration had been meticulous. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall had personally approved the reception. Marshall, the architect of the entire U.S. Army expansion, the man who had turned a force of 74,000 in 1939 into millions by 1943, knew exactly what was at stake. He sat in his office at the Pentagon that morning, the room sparse and functional. A large desk, maps of every theater on the walls, a single family photograph on a side table. No decorations, no ego. His deputy, Major General Thomas Handy, laid the latest dispatches on the desk. "Eisenhower's report is clear, sir. Fredendall's incompetence cost us 2,000 men and set the campaign back months. Patton's already turning it around." Marshall nodded, his face impassive. He had read the after-action reports himself. The bunker. the inflexible orders, the needless deaths. But there was more to consider than one man's failure. "If we court-martial him," Marshall said quietly, "the press will dig. They'll find out how unprepared we were. No tanks with guns that could match the German 88s. Infantry divisions trained for desert fighting in Louisiana swamps. Officers promoted for politics, not competence. Congress will haul Eisenhower before committees. Roosevelt will have to answer questions about why we're losing to Rommel after 2 years of war." Handy shifted uncomfortably. "But sir, the men in Sec Corps, they know what happened. Word's already spreading through the ranks." "That's why we handle it quietly," Marshall replied. His voice carried the weight of a man who had buried his own doubts long ago. "Relieve him without fanfare. Replace him with Patton. Let the battlefield speak. But Fredendall, he goes home a hero. Or at least a man who tried." It was a calculation, cold and precise. Marshall had built the army from scratch. He had handpicked nearly every general officer, fighting off political appointees and congressional favorites at every turn. To admit that one of his choices had cost thousands of American lives, not to enemy fire, but to his own arrogance, would invite scrutiny that could unravel everything. Investigations, budget cuts, delays in reinforcements, the war effort itself might falter. Better to protect the system, better to sacrifice truth for momentum. Fredendall was whisked to the War Department in a staff car, sirens clearing the way. There, in a private briefing room, he was greeted by Marshall himself. The two men shook hands. No aides. No notes. "You did your best under difficult circumstances," Marshall said. His eyes were steady, betraying nothing. Fredendall hesitated, then nodded. Relief washed over him, warm and unexpected. He had spent the flight steeling himself for condemnation. Instead, this, absolution. "We need men of your experience here at home," Marshall continued. "Training commands, logistics. The war won't be won in Tunisia alone." Fredendall straightened. "I understand, sir. Thank you." As he left the building, reporters swarmed again. He gave a brief statement. "The boys in Africa are doing a fine job. We'll have the Germans on the run soon." The words felt right, true even. In his mind, the disaster at Kasserine was already reframing itself. Not as his failure, but as the inevitable growing pains of a new army. He had been the one brave enough to hold the line. That night, in a suite at the Mayflower Hotel, Fredendall poured himself a scotch and read the evening papers. Headlines praised the returning hero of North Africa. Photographs showed him saluting the band, looking resolute. He smiled for the first time in weeks. The system had protected him. Why shouldn't it? He was connected. West Point class of 1907, old friends in Congress, a reputation for administrative efficiency that had served him well before the shooting started. Across the ocean, in Tunisia, the contrast burned like acid. Soldiers of the 34th Division huddled around campfires in the shadow of Jebel el-Kef, sharing cigarettes and tinned rations. One private, a kid from Brooklyn named Rossi, unfolded a week-old Stars and Stripes. His hands were still bandaged from burns at Faid. "Hey fellas," he called out, "you see this?" The group gathered. Rossi read aloud. "Major General Lloyd Fredendall, former commander of Tukad Corps in Tunisia, arrived in Washington today to a hero's welcome. The general is expected to take a key training command stateside." Silence fell. Then a low murmur. A sergeant spat into the fire. "Hero's welcome? That son of a bitch got my brother killed. Ordered us to sit there like ducks while the Krauts shelled us to hell." Another voice bitter. "And Patton? He's got us fighting smart, holding ground that makes sense, but Fredendall gets a parade?" Rossi crumpled the paper. "Washington don't care about us. We're just numbers to them." Halverson overheard from his nearby tent. He had received his own copy earlier that day. The words blurred on the page. He thought of the ridgeline, the screams, the dog tags he still carried in his pocket. Now this, a band, cameras, praise. In Algiers, Eisenhower read the same headlines with a tight jaw. He had relieved Fredendall to save lives. Now Marshall was rewriting history to save face. Ike said nothing publicly. He couldn't. His own command depended on Washington's support. But in private to his aide he muttered, "It's politics, always politics." Marshall's fear deepened in the days that followed. More reports came in, rumors of unrest in the ranks, letters home questioning command decisions. Congressmen called his office, subtle inquiries from Fredendall's patrons. "The general deserves recognition, George. A promotion would show the country we're rewarding valor." Marshall stared at the maps on his wall. Every pin represented lives under his responsibility. Expose Fredendall and the whole board might collapse. Punishing Fredendall would expose more than one failure. June 1st, 1943. The Pentagon's River Entrance Hall. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, flags hanging motionless in the conditioned air. A small assembly of officers, congressmen, and selected press stood in a half-circle beneath the high ceiling. No fanfare this time. No band, no cameras flashing in a frenzy. This was quieter, more deliberate. The kind of ceremony that whispers rather than shouts. General George C. Marshall stepped forward. In his hand was the single silver star that would transform a major general into a lieutenant general. He pinned it to Lloyd Fredendall's shoulder with the same steady hands that had signed orders sending divisions across oceans. The two men exchanged salutes. A brief handshake, a murmured, "Congratulations, General." Applause followed, polite, restrained, but unmistakable. Fredendall stood taller. The third star caught the overhead light and threw it back in sharp points. He had spent the week since his return in a blur of briefings, luncheons, and quiet meetings with influential members of the House and Senate Military Affairs Committees. Old friends from his early career had made calls. Letters had been written. Subtle pressure had been applied. Fredendall was a West Pointer, a loyal administrator, a man who had held the line in Africa under trying conditions. To punish him would be to punish the army itself. Marshall had waited every night. In the silence of his office, after the corridors emptied and the building settled, he would sit with the report spread before him. Casualty lists from Kasserine, Patton's terse after-action summaries, Eisenhower's private cable, relief necessary to preserve fighting effectiveness. He knew the truth. He also knew the cost of admitting it. Congress was restless. Pearl Harbor was still fresh. The public demanded victories, not excuses. If Fredendall were dragged before a committee, grilled about bunkers and inflexible orders, the questions would not stop at one general. They would reach Marshall's own promotion board. The officer selection process, the training pipeline, the entire mobilization effort built on speed over perfection. One crack in the facade, and the whole structure might shudder. So Marshall chose. He chose the institution over the individual. He chose momentum over justice. He signed the promotion recommendation himself. The news reached Tunisia within days, carried on crackling shortwave broadcasts and dog-eared copies of Stars and Stripes. Soldiers read it in slit trenches in the backs of 6x6 trucks around flickering Coleman lanterns. The reaction was the same everywhere. Stunned silence, then slow, boiling anger. In the 34th Division's rear area near Gafsa, Colonel Halverson sat on an ammunition crate outside his new command tent, the paper open on his knees. The headline was simple: Fredendall promoted to Lt. Gen. Takes command of 2nd Army Training Wing. He read the article twice. Then he folded the paper carefully, as though handling something contaminated, and placed it on the ground beside him. His operations officer, the same major from the Fade days, watched from a few feet away. "They gave him a star," the major said. It wasn't a question. Halverson nodded once. 3 of them now. The major laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My brother's still in a grave near Faid. They haven't even marked it properly yet. And Fredendall gets a promotion." Halverson looked out across the desert floor where Patton's tanks were maneuvering in the distance, dust plumes rising like smoke signals. Patton's turning this corps into something that can win. But the men who died under Fredendall, they don't get a star. They get a wooden cross. Word spread through the ranks like shrapnel. Officers who had protested Fredendall's orders and been relieved for it found their efficiency reports suddenly downgraded. Major General Orlando Ward, commander of the 1st Armored Division, had clashed repeatedly with Fredendall over defensive dispositions. Now he was quietly reassigned to a training command in the States, his combat career effectively over. Battalion commanders who had begged for permission to maneuver were passed over for promotion. Careers that had been on the rise stalled, then began to slide backward. Patton felt it most keenly. He had never liked Fredendall, considered him a martinet and a coward, but he had expected the system to at least pretend at fairness. Instead, he watched the same army that had rewarded incompetence now punish the men who had tried to salvage it. In private letters to his wife Beatrice, he wrote with rare bitterness, "They promote the man who lost the battle and sideline the ones who won it back. If this is what we are fighting for, God help us." The moral injury ran deep. Patton had always believed in ruthless accountability on the battlefield. Relieve the timid, reward the bold, let results speak. Now he saw that above the battlefield, accountability was negotiable. The rules changed when the audience was Congress, the press, and the American public. Failure could be managed if it threatened the wrong people. In Washington, Marshall moved on. He approved more promotions, signed more orders, stared at more maps. He never spoke of Fredendall again in public. The decision had been made. The precedent was set. Quietly, invisibly, the Army had learned a new truth. Survival of the institution outweighed justice for the individual. Halverson carried the weight of it every day. He led his regiment through the next offensives, Sfax and Fittaville, the final push to Tunis. But something in him had cracked. He stopped writing letters home. He stopped keeping a journal. When the campaign ended and decorations were handed out, he accepted his silver star without ceremony. He knew who would never be decorated. In the dusty camps of Tunisia, men still read the papers. They still saw the photographs. They still felt the rage. In Washington, failure could be managed. In Tunisia, it could not. The campaign ended in May 1943. Tunis fell. Bizerte fell. The last German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered in their tens of thousands, hands raised under a sky that had finally stopped raining shells. Seventh Corps marched through the streets of Tunis in victory parades that felt both earned and hollow. The same men who had bled at Kasserine now stood in formation. Rifles shouldered, faces hardened into something permanent. They had won. They had also learned. In the years that followed, the war rolled on. Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine. The American Army grew into the most powerful land force the world had ever seen. Equipment improved, doctrine sharpened, casualties mounted, but so did victories. The lessons of Kasserine were studied, dissected, taught in staff colleges. Never again, the manuals said. Never again will we allow rigid command from the rear to cost us lives. The manuals never mentioned Fredendall by name. Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall spent the rest of the war in the United States. He commanded the Second Army, responsible for training hundreds of thousands of troops on the vast maneuver grounds of Tennessee and the Carolinas. He wrote reports. He inspected divisions. He attended dinners with senators and industrialists. Photographs show him smiling beside production lines, churning out Shermans and half-tracks, his 3 stars gleaming. He retired in 1946 with full honors, a pension, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had survived the system he had once commanded. He never wrote memoirs. He rarely spoke of Tunisia. When asked by interviewers in later years, he would offer the same careful phrase, "We did what we could with what we had." Then he would change the subject. Colonel James Halverson came home in late 1945. He had fought from El Guitar to the Vosges, from the Siegfried Line to the Elbe. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, a Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster. His men called him the Quiet One, the officer who never raised his voice, but whose orders were always obeyed. He never spoke publicly about Kasserine. He never mentioned Fredendall by name. In 1947, he left the Army. He took a job as a regional manager for a farm equipment company in Iowa. He married a nurse he had met in a field hospital outside Naples. They had 2 sons. He rarely attended veterans' reunions. When he did, he sat in the back, listened to the stories, and left early. His sons later said he kept a small metal box in the attic. Dog tags, a faded map of Fayed Pass, a single piece of paper from February 1943 with Fredendall's order to hold the ridgeline. He never opened it in their presence.